Thank you, Brian. I value the Horton seminars enormously. I reckon I'm probably one of the longest standing contributors. I haven't quite done 40 years, but I'm getting on that way. And they have been fantastic bringing together of people operations for which I'm truly grateful to Brian and Anna and their team and their family. I should apologise that I am off theme as far as the plan of this year's seminar is concerned. After my talk last year about the Medici and Maiolica in the earlier Renaissance, I was asked to take the story forward to the Medici family's most remarkable, there's a lovely Italian word, strepitoso, which means sort of noisy, contribution to world ceramic history, Medici porcelain. I've been for a long time at the Ashmolean, so I shall start from my home base. This is C.D.E. Fortnum, a great Victorian connoisseur, scholar, collector of sculpture and the decorative arts, particularly of the European Renaissance, and so important a benefactor of the Ashmolean that the Dictionary of National Biography called him the second founder of the Ashmolean Museum. About 1894, not long before his death, he had himself portrayed at his home in Great Stanmore in the classic contemplative pose of a collector and connoisseur. And the object he chose to be painted with was this small, exquisite ewer. By this time, as his choice indicates, Medici porcelain had become almost unequal as the ultimate collectible for a French or British amateur. A recent meticulous listing by the Florentine scholar Alessandro Alinari records 60 known intact pieces of Medici porcelain. Of these, nearly all were already known and recognised in Fortnum's time. Fortnum had owned 3. He'd given 2 to the British Museum, which, when I worked at the British Museum, I thought was a fine thing to have done. But since I've moved to the Ashmolean, where the rest of Fortnum's collection is, I take a slightly different view. The fact that Fortnum had accumulated 3 is despite the fact that Medici porcelain was a new discovery for collectors within what was then living memory. In 1857, the Florentine physician and art dealer Alessandro Foresi had recognized an example, misidentified, in the collection of the Anglo-Florentine collector and dealer William Blundell Spence in Florence, marked with the dome of Florence Cathedral, bought it, and written an account of its production. We'll come back to the specific object. Foresi's essay launched a frenzy of collecting, especially in England and in France. Hooray. So effectively did dealers and collectors, notably the Rothschilds, and museums, notably in England and France, hoover up examples that there are now more examples at Sèvres, for example, 9, and here they all are, than in all Italian museums put together. That's not to speak for the other objects in the Louvre and in Paris Rothschild collections. Medici porcelain, as Brian said, is the first successful attempt to make a kind of porcelain in Europe of which we have identified examples. That's different from saying it's the earliest European porcelain, and we'll come back to that. In the 15th century, Chinese porcelain was beginning to arrive in Europe in some quantity through the Islamic world. As a traded luxury item, but also by way of diplomatic gift, it came in especially through Venice. It was there that Andrea Mantegna, about 1500, painted a porcelain cup holding gold coins, holding the gifts of one of the 3 magi to the baby Jesus. The collection of Chinese porcelain, which was started in Florence in the mid-15th century by Piero, colourfully known as the Gatti, and extended by his son, Lorenzo the Magnificent, who died in 1492, was famous and was partly acquired by way of diplomatic gift. In 1487, for instance, a gift from the Egyptian Sultan in Cairo to Lorenzo included large jars of porcelain, of the sort which the like has never been seen, nor of better workmanship. The Medici collection, thus begun, has been described, including by me, as the largest in Europe at the time, but that's actually wrong. Recently, a post-mortem inventory of Eleonora of Aragon, Duchess of Ferrara, who died in 1493, the year after Lorenzo, has been published showing that she had some 170 pieces, more than 3 times the number listed in Lorenzo's inventory. Chinese porcelain, with its seemingly magical technical mastery, exceeded in value, financial value that is, all other ceramics on the Renaissance market, though it was rarely too good to use in aristocratic households. Efforts were made continually to imitate it, but Italian potters had neither the kaolinitic clays nor the high-temperature kilns needed to make true porcelain, which was not, of course, achieved in Europe till Böttger's discoveries at Dresden in 1708-9. Various attempts to imitate porcelain in Renaissance Italy are known from documents. The 3 principal cities in the story are the 3 places where we know substantial quantities of Chinese porcelain were to be found: Venice, Ferrara, and Florence. In Venice, the great centre of glass-making, documentary references in 1504, 1518, and 1519 indicate that craftsmen there were producing what they claimed to be a form of porcelain, but it was more likely a form, I think, of Lattimore glass. Subsequent experiments are recorded elsewhere, but it seems that the first viable European porcelain was made in Ferrara, where Duke Alfonso II d'Este employed 2 brothers, Camillo and Battista Gatti, of Castel Durante. Camillo was killed in 1567 after a piece of artillery he was examining exploded after someone imprudently put a candle too close to it. Camillo lived for a few days, but apparently did not respond to increasingly desperate requests to tell the secret of his porcelain making. In reporting his death, the Florentine ambassador described him as Camillo of Urbino, potter and painter, but so to speak alchemist to his excellency, who was the modern rediscovery of porcelain. Alchemist, of course, is the key word here, exactly as it is when one is thinking about Böttger 150 years later. The problem of porcelain manufacture in Ferrara is complicated by Vasari, who, in the edition of his Lives of the Artist published in 1568, the year after Camillo's death, mentioned not the Gatti brothers, but the most excellent maestro Giulio da Urbino, who is now working, writes Vasari, for the most illustrious Duke Alfonso II of Ferrara. He makes stupendous things of various sorts of earthenware and gives charm to porcelain vessels. No such Giulio is mentioned in the Ferrarese archives as working for Duke Alfonso there. Vasari might be referring to an otherwise undocumented stay in Ferrara by the talented but itinerant Urbino Maiolica painter who signed some earlier work, Giulio da Urbino, in which case Vasari is perhaps referring to the decoration of porcelain, since we know Giulio as a Maiolica painter rather than as a technician, referring to the decoration of porcelain rather than to its manufacture. It might refer to someone completely different, or it might just be a mistake by Vasari. Much mystery still surrounds this Ferrarese porcelain project, but it seems from the documents to have produced results before and after Camillo's death, and has a good claim to be the first successful attempt in Europe to imitate Chinese porcelain. No examples of Ferrarese porcelain have been identified, but to find it, either in collections or in excavations in Ferrara, would be one of the great ceramic discoveries of our time. At the same time, in Florence, experiments were taking place under the aegis of Grand Duke Francesco I de' Medici, who was fascinated by new technology of all sorts. Montaigne, visiting Florence in 1568, described him as a grand mécanique. I find that lovely phrase, a great practical experimenter. Vasari, in his Lives, tells how the multi-talented Florentine artist Bernardo Buontalenti, a key operative in Francesco's artistic operations, Vasari says, has shown wonderful genius in every sort of field. He has skillfully found the way to melt and purify rock crystal. and made of it narrative works and vases of various colours. Furthermore, his talent will shortly be seen in achieving vases of porcelain with all the perfection of ancient ones. Ancient ones is an interesting expression. I think Vasari must really have been thinking of Chinese because there's no possible prototype among ancient pottery as it was known in the 16th century. But it's an odd use of the word. Vasari was certainly well informed about the Medici workshop, so in 1568, when he wrote, porcelain had not yet been made there. By 1575, however, the Venetian ambassador in Florence, and these ambassadors between Florentine cities and other European cities are an absolutely fabulous and riveting historical source. And in 1575, the Venetian ambassador reported that Francesco has rediscovered the way of making Indian porcelain, and in his experiments has equalled its qualities: transparency, firing, lightness, and delicacy. It has taken him more than 10 years to discover the secret, but a Levantino, a man from the Eastern Mediterranean or the Middle East, showed him the route to success. Francesco's principal workshop was in the Casino di San Marco, a building, as you see, still there, just off Piazza San Marco, where all the Fra Angelicos are, a building designed by Buontalenti and finished in 1574, where alchemists, goldsmiths, hardstone craftsmen, and glassmakers worked alongside the team making porcelain. Something of the atmosphere, though slightly earlier, is given by a painting by Stradanos of an alchemist's workshop, on your right, painted in 1570 for Francesco Studiolo in the Palazzo Vecchio. The boy holding a large vase in the very center of the picture has been thought to be a teenager called Niccolò Sisti, and we will come back to Niccolò Sisti. At this point, it would be normal to show you a portrait of Francesco, and I can do that because there was discovered in a drawer with a whole lot of junk in the Uffizi in 1881, this relief portrait of Francesco, which is indeed Medici porcelain, and it is the only thing of its sort that exists. So luckily it wasn't chucked away, but was transferred to the newly opened Bargello Museum at the same time. Francesco was closely involved in the operations and is the hero of this story. In 1576, the Venetian ambassador, another of these ambassadors, reported the Grand Duke has a place called the Casino, in which, like a miniature arsenal, the references to the great industrial complex of the Arsenale in Venice, not to any football ground, various masters work in various rooms on various projects. It is here that he keeps his distilleries and all his experimental equipment. So Francesco was really hands-on in this. He goes there in the morning and stays there till dinner time. Then after dinner comes and stays till the evening. What exactly was going on as far as the administration of the Grand Duchy is concerned is not entirely clear. Together with the mysterious Levantino, several Italians expert in Maiolica were involved in Francesco's project to make porcelain. The head of the project for a time was Flaminio Fontana, grandson of the Urbino potter Guido Durantino, the creator of the most successful Maiolica workshop in mid-16th century Urbino. Flaminio worked in Florence between 1573 and 1578. His collaborators included Pier Maria and Jacopo di Filippo, both from Faenza, another great Maiolica centre, of course, and they were joined by a young man, Niccolò Sisti, who'd come to Florence with his father from their home of Norcia in Umbria. Sisti is described in documents as stillatore, a distiller, and seems to have been an expert in kiln technology, who also made glass. Medici porcelain is technically, as well as stylistically, an amalgam of East and West, and owes something to fritwares from the Islamic world. A study by the scientists Kingery and Van Diver suggested that the inspiration of the high silica body was surely Levantine, referring to Middle Eastern fritwares. But the technology used was wholly Italian. Vasari's reference to Buontalenti melting rock crystal is echoed by a recipe of about 1585, which includes not what one would expect sand as the major silicate component, but ground rock crystal. Given how expensive rock crystal was, that's a remarkable substance to be using. The firing temperatures, around 1100 degrees centigrade, were higher than those used in Maiolica, and they pushed the limits of Italian technology, and many pieces show signs of overfiring, and there's likely to have been a high failure rate, especially at the beginning. This magnificent large flask in Turin is one of the most monumental pieces of Medici porcelain surviving, and you can see that the blue is slightly blurred into the glaze overall, something which doesn't very often happen with Maiolica, and that the glaze has severely bubbled underneath. The Florentine mark is there, but you can see how the glaze has pitted and bubbled through overfiring. The design sources of Medici porcelain are eclectic. The ornament owes most to its explicit model, Chinese porcelain, doubtless copied from examples in the Medici collection, which had been growing still ever since the time of Piero and Lorenzo, which I mentioned before. On the left is the pilgrim flask which Ferrarese found in William Blundell Spence's house in Florence in 1857, which started the whole story off, and which is now in the Gatti Museum. In the middle is a plate in the Hockemeyer collection in Bremen. To my eye, very Chinese in decoration, but with that narrow rim. Not an Italian Maiolica shape, and not, I think, Rose may correct me, a Chinese porcelain shape, but a shape that is neither one nor the other, a Medici porcelain shape. Going back to the flask on the left, the mark that Ferrarese recognized is this mark, uncomfortably covered by a little round label, but not my fault, as representing, though it's rather a bad representation, looks rather more like Michelangelo than Brunelleschi, the dome of Florence Cathedral, called by Florentines the cupolone, the big cupola. The F, which usually accompanies the mark, may stand for Firenze, for Florence, but I think it's more likely to stand for Francesco, and I'll show you why a little bit later. The combination of the cupolone mark and F is the commonest, but not the only, mark on Medici porcelain, and a considerable number of examples are completely unmarked. The flask in Washington, on the right, very pretty thing, is said to have been discovered unrecognized by the squillionaire collector Joseph Widener among porcelain from the Pierpont Morgan collection at Duveen's in New York. Anything more improbable than that Duveen's, of all companies, would not have recognized a piece of marked Medici porcelain. It's difficult to imagine, but it is true that Widener paid a remarkably low price for it. It may be that cunning old Joseph Duveen thought that this was a sprat to catch the very substantial mackerel that Joseph Duveen was to become as a client. Some pieces of Medici porcelain, Chinese porcelain on the left, Medici porcelain in the middle, Iznik, blue and white, on the right. Some pieces of Medici porcelain have been thought by specialists to have decorative elements derived from Islamic blue and white. Julian Raby has suggested that pieces like this bowl in the middle are based on Iznik wares of a so-called wheat sheaf design. I have to say that to a non-specialist eye like mine, some blue and white made by Islamic potters has ornament so alarmingly like its Chinese prototypes that I have to leave the identification of possible influence and links from Islamic pottery as opposed to Chinese to specialists in that field. I think, however, as Rose pointed out to me earlier, the Medici porcelain potters would have been able easily to tell the technical difference between Islamic fritware fritware from the Islamic world, I should say, and porcelain. And they would surely have been trying to imitate porcelain. So I think the starting point should be that you should be looking for models in porcelain, not for blue and white from the Islamic world. Most of the shapes owe little to Chinese porcelain, but a lot to forms invented by Buontalenti and his associates in goldsmiths' work and hardstone. This is my absolute favourite piece of Medici porcelain in the world. It's completely in the manner of the kind of hardstone and goldsmiths' work that was being made in the Casino by Buontalenti and his friends. I mean, you can imagine this made in lapis lazuli, and it's just scrumptious. These rather wacky double cruets for oil and vinegar could be a Buontalenti design, though I wouldn't have been surprised to find an earlier example in some of the exotic shapes you find in Faenza white Maiolica. Alternatively, one might look for versions of the form in glass, but despite the help of some kind friends, the examples I know in glass and also in Chinese porcelain are all much later than this. So my best guess is that this is a Buontalenti ingenuity design that then spreads to other media. The lower left one, which ought to be at Chatsworth, but wasn't there when I was recently at Chatsworth, at least wasn't shown, may be one of the two recorded in Grand Duke Ferdinando's inventory in 1590. Due vasi doppi di porcellana a lumaca, da olio e aceto. Two porcelain double snail vases for oil and vinegar. Nice description, really. Most Medici porcelain is blue and white, with some drawing in manganese. But here is a lovely ewer, now on loan to the Met, and one of the most expensive pieces of European ceramics ever sold, when it was sold, I think, in Paris, with polychrome grotesques, somewhat in the manner of the grotesques being made in the 1570s in the Fontana family workshop in Urbino. Two exceptional pieces are painted in an historiato style derived from Maiolica. These are painted in Urbino style and may well have been painted by Flaminio Fontana. When the piece, now in the British Museum, on the right, was sold at the Mighty Stowe sale, Dukes of Buckingham and Chandos, in 1848, the catalogue purred. This vase has long been considered a perfect chef d'oeuvre of Raphael ware. It's indeed a wonderful specimen of design and colour, the figures being pencilled with great delicacy of touch and vigour of action, while in purity of outline it may fairly compete with the antique. It continued to be thought to be Maiolica, the body having been masked by later silver gilt handles, continued to be thought to be Maiolica for well over 100 years, and only in 1976 was it recognised by that marvellous scholar Johanna Lessmann of Hamburg as porcelain. Scientific analysis has since confirmed that the body is indistinguishable from blue and white Medici porcelain. So Medici porcelain is what it is. I momentarily, years ago, when I first was cataloguing this for an exhibition at the British Museum in 1987, toyed with the possibility that these two, which are obviously of the same origin, might be Ferrara porcelain, but that won't hold up. The British Museum flask is after a German print. So surprisingly are all the other Medici porcelain pieces, which derived from figurative graphic sources. The St. Mark dish in the Bargello, on the left, is derived from an engraving by Heinrich Aldegrever from a series of the Evangelist published in 1539, and the Death of Saul, on the right, on the plate in the Met, from a woodcut by Sebald Bayham published in 1533. It seems to me odd, and I can't explain it, that amid the artistic ferment of Mannerist Florence, fairly simple, indeed rudimentary German prints, 40-odd years old, should have been preferred as graphic sources. We know that the experiments to make porcelain in Florence had succeeded by 1575. The technical problems and the failure rate meant that it was never a commercial product, and it depended on the patronage of the Grand Duke. Francesco died in 1587, and production declined in Florence without his active involvement. However, Grand Duke Ferdinando, his successor, continued to provide some support, particularly to Niccolò Sisti. Sisti, with a specialist in kiln technology, continued to make porcelain and glass with financial support from Ferdinando, setting up a new workshop in Pisa where porcelain, glass and also maiolica were made until about 1620. Most of the pieces of Medici porcelain we have probably date from the years 1575 to 1587. That's to say, all within the lifetime of Grand Duke Francesco. But the chronological fixed points are few, and it's hard to make out any stylistic or technical development. I know of no piece that can be definitely dated after 1587, and I'm unable to show you any definite example of Pisa porcelain. Apart from the porcelain relief of Grand Duke Francesco I, which I showed you at the beginning, which is dated 1586, the only dated example is one of 2 bottles at Sèvres with the arms of King Philip II of Spain. Every reason to believe this was a diplomatic gift from the Grand Duke to the all-powerful King of Spain, and that's dated 1581. A possibly early experimental piece is a pilgrim frass in the Louvre, which has the word prova, test, written underneath it. But it's not certain that this is an early experiment, rather than just being a trial, say, of a different body formula. One of the largest and most impressive examples of Medici porcelain was by 1859 in the collection of one of the Paris Rothschilds. It remained in the family, like so many scrumptious things, many of which, incidentally, as many of you will know, will be coming up at auction in October with Christie's. But this ewer was very badly broken by shippers in the 1980s. After being meticulously restored, I'm given to understand it was broken into 50-odd pieces. It was bought as a brilliant acquisition by Alan Darr for the Detroit Institute of Arts in 2000. The arms on this are those of Grand Duke Francesco and his wife Johanna of Austria. She died in childbirth in 1578, so the ewer can be firmly dated before that year. In 1576, the Ferrarese ambassador to Florence reported that Francesco had shown the ambassador several large pieces. The ambassador commented that he did so with great pleasure because he'd not expected that this porcelain of his would succeed in large pieces. It seems plausible to suppose that the Detroit ewer was one of these large pieces, and Alan Darr has suggested the design and also the modelling of this ewer were by Buontalenti himself. So this is a not only a wonderfully monumental and brilliantly made piece of Medici porcelain, but one of the few pieces that is datable to the early years, and it carries with it, as an early example, the similar ewer in Turin that I showed you a few minutes ago. The Detroit ewer does not, as you see lower right, have the cupolone mark, but a much more elaborate one, which only occurs on one other piece. In the centre is a roundel with 3 fleurs-de-lis, around which are 5 other roundels. These are the so-called palle, the roundels, the balls of the Medici arms. And with the fleurs-de-lis, they make up the arms of the main line of the Medici family. In the roundels are initials that have been read as FMMED2, for Francescus Medicis Magnus Etruriae Dux II, Francesco de' Medici, 2nd Grand Duke of Tuscany. This is here, the F evidently stands for Francesco, and that's why I think that when you get the cupolone mark accompanied by an F, that F is probably more likely to be conceived as being for Francesco. It was very much a personal project of his rather than for Firenze. After production at Pisa ceased by about 1620, the actual examples were largely forgotten by collectors until Ferrarese's rediscovery in the 1850s, though the story was known about in Florence from literary sources. Its existence was apparently known at Doccia, and I'd be glad of guidance from the experts in this room about this. Its existence was apparently known at Doccia in the 1740s, since copies of the cathedral dome mark and the letter F are said to be found on a few pieces of early Ginori porcelain, but I've never seen an example of these myself. If somebody has and can assure me that the mark is authentically of the 1740s, I'd be glad to know. But Medici porcelain does seem to have been unknown to the reinventors of porcelain, Louis Poterat in Rouen in the 1670s, and later Bürtger. I will, however, mention here, John Mallet is not here, but this is really in tribute to him. Two pieces which are effectively the only porcelain made in Europe between the end of Medici porcelain and the Poterat experiments at Rouen in the 1670s, two mysterious porcelain bowls in the V&A, which are dated 1627 and 1638. They've traditionally been attributed to Padua, complicated argument that I've returned to in the catalogue of an exhibition I did last year for the Museum für Angewandte Kunst in Vienna. But some years ago, John presented intriguing archival evidence they might instead have been made in Liguria, in Genoa or Savona. They await definitive attribution, but in any case, this has to be a project entirely unconnected with the Medici workshops. Since 1859, as I said at the beginning, surviving pieces of Medici porcelain have been among the prime icons of modern collecting, and there are now only a handful outside museums, and they have reached some of the highest prices ever paid for European ceramics. They may be pretty rare now, but it is a mistake to think that production was always on a very small scale, though it was experimental. In inventories of Medici properties between 1587 and 1590, the years immediately after Francesco's death, some 900 examples are listed, and there will have been many others that had been given away as gifts. A single gift from Grand Duke Ferdinando II to a member of his household in 1629 contained 506 examples of porcelain made in the casino. So no doubt about what they were. Not all these will have been marked. It's surely not too much to hope that some more might be out there somewhere, misidentified as Chinese. So go out and search. Thank you very much.